Thank you for taking time out of your very busy days to attend today's webinar, which is titled Integrating Behavior Supports into MTSS for Student Success. Today's webinar is presented by our distinguished guests, Dr. Mel Collier-Meek and Dr. Alex Pierce. Before we begin, I want to thank our corporate sponsors, Horace Mann and MCM Fundraising, whose ongoing support helps us to bring high-quality professional development to school leaders in Connecticut. Horace Mann knows educators are taking care of our children's future, and Horace Mann believes they deserve someone to look after theirs. They provide auto, home, and life insurance to protect school employees and what they have today, and retirement and financial solutions to help them secure for tomorrow. And at MCM Fundraising, they believe that by exceeding your expectations, they will build the solid partnership you deserve with great customer service that takes the guesswork out of running a successful campaign. To find out more information, go to my.mcmfundraising.com. I also would like to take a minute to go over the logistics of how we'll proceed with the webinar today during the presentation. All of you in the audience are muted. You can share any questions you have using the Q&A feature during the live presentation. We are recording the webinar and we'll make that recording available to you within the next couple of days. And now a little background about our guests. Dr. Mel Collier-Meek is an associate professor of school psychology at Teachers College at Columbia University. Dr. Collier-Meek is a co-founder of the Sustain Collaborative with Dr. Lisa Cinetti. She's also a licensed psychologist and BCBA. Dr. Collier-Meek and Dr. Cinetti work with Dr. Alex Pierce, assistant research professor at UConn, to conduct applied research to support elementary school teachers' delivery of behavior support plans. Together, they have published extensively, received over $5 million in grant funding for applied school-based implementation research, and collaborate regularly with Connecticut and New York City schools to support MTSS implementation. And now I turn it over to our distinguished presenters. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. We're so glad to present and share our reflections and thoughts, and we hope our perspective will be helpful to the busiest people in the business. And so thank you, attendees, for making time for us today. I'm coming to you from my Stonington, Connecticut home, where my kids are off at Connecticut Public Schools. So I'm very delighted to be presenting to this community and talking about how to integrate behavior supports into MTSS. And also, a through line of our presentation will be a focus on implementation, because it's not just that we need to understand or identify effective practices, but we need to actually support them to regularly happen. So I want to highlight a resource that Dr. Cinetti and I have developed to highlight the sustainability of effective practices. Please feel free to reach out to us through this network or our others. So let's get on the same page as we start about what a sustained practice is. So I'm using the word practice to refer to any intervention, program, curriculum, initiative, school-wide, classroom, district. We're talking about sustained practice as those practices that are implemented consistently and comprehensively over time. The difference between a one-shot practice or an exposure to a consistent practice for students. What we find is that when effective practices, like the behavioral practices, like your MTSS practices, are sustained, that is implemented consistently and comprehensively across time, students do better. They do better more quickly. And this makes sense. This makes sense when we think across context. So if we think about wanting to build strength, your doctor might recommend 30 minutes of exercise 5 days a week. And we know if you follow through on that plan, you're likely to receive greater improvements. But if life happens, as it inevitably does, and you're only able to go twice a week, or when you go, you're only able to go for 15 minutes, you will likely see improvements, but they'll be smaller and they'll be slower. And so one thing you might work on with your doctor is not adjusting the recommendation, but adjusting and finding a way to be more consistent in your practice of the initial recommendation. The same is true for reading, for SEL, for behavior, for writing, for math. The research is really clear. When students have the opportunity to consistently access practices, we see greater gains. So when we think about behavior change or initiatives, it's not just that we need to pick the best one or the right one for that time, but we need to figure out how to support them to happen consistently. So when we sustain our practice, first, it's good for kids, right? We're going to see those more efficient, effective gains. It's also better for educators who aren't confused about which initiative they're doing now and what they should attend to, but rather have an understanding of what they need to kind of deeply focus on, are prepared to do that, and can do that across time. It saves resources as we're not shifting different practices. We also aren't kind of looking to put more intensive practices in place when the initial practice might be sufficiently effective if it's implemented. And in many cases, it's required by law. So when we see, for example, IEPs, students are entitled to receive those services consistently and comprehensively. And that's a measure of sustained practice. How do we support our MTSS practice to happen as intended? How do we support IEPs to happen as intended? So we are big in talking about not just, again, new ideas, but how we can make sure these practices happen. And as administrators, you have a lot of opportunity to support the sustained practice in your setting. So we have many resources on our website with different orientations and aspects of implementation and implementation leadership. We're going to, during this presentation today, focus in on how can we understand the process of implementation so we can think about attending to it better and having our efforts be more successful and sustained. So we're going to orient to implementation as a process, not a one-time event. So when we think about taking on a new routine or a new habit, we want to be thoughtful about how we can set ourselves up for success and then how we can support ourselves over time. So we are going to walk through a 4-step process on the phases of implementation and how we can be thoughtfully attending and supporting implementation of the practices we care about so we can see those gains for students and educators in our setting. We're going to focus on real key takeaways that you can use in your school meetings and school settings. So the first being during the explore stage, when you're trying to figure out what should we focus on or where should we put our effort, how can we be strategic? Here, we want to really encourage you to be focusing on a small number of new and needed practices. So we know that there's a lot of latest and greatest and new ideas, but what we find is while these practices might be wonderful and exciting, when we focus on a smaller number of practices, we can sustain them more effectively, our educators are less overwhelmed, and they actually meet our students. So I want you to do some reflecting and thinking about your MTSS systems as it relates to academics and behavior, and reflect on what is going well. What are aspects of your school processes that are happening fluently? And how can we encourage that to happen even more consistently? What are those practices within our MTSS systems that you know aren't really happening effectively? And can we drop them? Can we take them off folks' plate? And when we look at what we have going well, or what we kind of want to remove, are there a very few number of things that we absolutely need, that we need to bring into our setting? And this sort of planful consideration and adoption takes more time initially, but again, is related to much stronger sustainability across time. So let's talk about how we can kind of think through these questions a little bit more. I really encourage you and your school teams to think about something called resource mapping. And again, it's not super complicated, but rather before we take on something new, let's make a list of what we're already doing in our school. And let's see who's doing what and how it's going, and use that to decide systematically if we should take something else on. Very often we have overlapping initiatives or kind of more than one person doing a very similar thing. And when we take a look at our resources broadly, we can be more planful about what we need to take on and what we need to take off of our plates before we go forward. We can do that when we think about our tiered behavioral practices. I really encourage you to think about what supports you have across the tiers. You may find that, for example, your social worker, your school psychologist, and others are running very similar groups. And maybe, you can make one person in charge of a group and have the other person freed up to do other things. Or you aren't keeping quite track of the varied tier 2 intervention options. And so some of the students may not be, potentially experiencing the benefit of all that your school has to offer. So making a really clear list of what are our practices across tiers, what issues or challenges do these practices address, will also highlight gaps. Wow, we have 3 interventions to respond to disruptive behavior, but we don't necessarily have practices related to internalizing challenges. So we might need to look for 1 practice or 2 practices that address other issues that we're seeing in the school. So again, this planful kind of mapping, this resource mapping of what are we doing now? Where are the gaps between what we need and what are the few things that we can add while taking off ineffective or inefficient practices? And that leads us to de-implementation. So de-implementation is the process of removing ineffective practices before putting new practices in place. De-implementation is not failure. It is an important and critical part of school practice, and it's one that we can tend to struggle with. I know that as we have kind of relatively few resources, we may still be using reading books from several initiatives ago that might kind of guide students in different ways. And that might be kind of confusing to students and teachers who are navigating using old resources along with new resources. So we really want to take the time to, when we are moving on from something, making sure that we have consensus around that, making sure that we have fully kind of removed that program so that, again, teachers aren't feeling like they're juggling the initiatives from several years ago with the initiatives from now at the same time, really making it clear to our educators, this is where we want the focus and we can let go of old practices, using that growth mindset to build that positive implementation climate focused on change and growth. So I encourage you to, again, take the time to think about and use that strength-based perspective for your schools and districts. What is going well and how can we make it happen more? So maybe one of your teams has a strength in database decision-making. Maybe your school-wide practices are going really well. What can you see as a strength in your school building, and how can you double down and encourage that even more? Because again, those consistent, comprehensive practices can go such a long way. Then thinking about what can we take off people's plate? What can we remove? And then using that thoughtful approach to think about if there's additional practices that you absolutely need, and really making sure that you're comprehensively bringing them in and not just adding another thing on folks' plate. So Within the explore phase, and again, this is the behavior change process that you'll be continually going through with MTSS. Make sure that when you are taking on something new, it is absolutely needed. It's a small number, it's reasonable. So you can have the time to sufficiently prepare. I know that we're ready and to jump into the next thing, but we want to remember that most educators, just like most people, struggle to integrate a new practice into their existing routine. There's a reason that we as people struggle with taking on new healthy habits, that New Year's resolutions aren't followed through, that we get, so many reminders when we have a dentist appointment. All of these are examples of kind of us as people struggling to remember to take on new things. And so we need to know this about the folks that we work with and set them up for success by helping them to kind of implement in a sustained manner. So what do we mean by sustained practice or implementing with fidelity? What the goal is here is we want our educators to be able to deliver all the components of a practice, do it in a manner that is enthusiastic, responsive to student need, and do it for the appropriate amount of time. So a teacher who is just doing part of a reading lesson or part of an SEL curriculum is going to see different outcomes. The teacher that is delivering an SEL lesson, but reading in a monotone voice and not kind of being responsive to their students will likely have different outcomes than a teacher who is enthusiastic, encouraging, and responsive. And again, if we, just like the gym example we looked at earlier, if we have the kind of recommended practice, that SEL instruction happening for 5 minutes rather than the recommended 20 minutes, we're likely to see very different outcomes. So we want to be thinking about all of these aspects and making sure we're setting our educators up for success to implement with fidelity and sustain that practice across time. Unfortunately, the data are really clear that even after high quality training, fidelity tends to drop within 10 days or 2 school weeks. So even after kind of setting up an educator for success, even if they are ready to go, we tend to see a drop. Teachers have so many competing demands, new things come up, challenges arise, it's not fresh in our mind. And so we need to be aware of this potential drop and making adjustments to help set folks up for success long-term. So what does that look like? That looks like supporting educators in a responsive and multifaceted way. And you can see that this is part of why we want to have very few new initiatives so that we can comprehensively support folks when they take on new pieces. So we want to think about making sure whatever we take on fits our setting. So if we have a new SEL curriculum that needs to be implemented for an hour a week, do folks have an hour a week? If not, we need to help folks figure out where they're going to find it in their schedule or pare it back so that we can help educators take on something new while kind of keeping those critical components. So if I have only, a 20-minute block, I might tell my educators which parts I want them to focus on or look for a different curriculum that can reasonably fit our schedule. So kind of doing that kind of initial work rather than expecting educators to just kind of figure it out can really help facilitate that consistency across time. We want to make sure that folks experience high quality training. High quality training is the foundation for successful implementation. But too often in schools, we just expect that if we talk about something or if we send an email, that folks' behavior will change. But what we know from the literature and our own experience, our life experience and otherwise, is that we need training to clarify the expectations. We need training to help educators practice and model and be prepared for the kind of new implementation. Even teachers who are veteran teachers can benefit from ongoing support to prepare them for new activities and initiatives. And through the initial training, questions come up, they're clarified, and folks are more ready to go. Though, like we talked about earlier, training isn't always sufficient. Sometimes we know what to do, but don't necessarily make it a consistent part of our routine. So this is kind of step one, necessary but insufficient. I encourage you to be thinking about what are ways that you remind yourself to do something new or important. And how can we think about that and set our educators up for success? So if you're trying to do something new, do you set reminders on your phone? You put it in the calendar, you have a sticky note on your computer. What are those different responsive strategies that you use to prompt yourself, to encourage yourself to engage with a new practice? And then how can you help your educators to engage in those practices as well when they're doing something new? So as an example, we're supporting teachers to deliver the good behavior game, a highly effective tier 1 classroom practice that's relatively simple, but again, we find that teachers need support to implement it amongst everything else they're doing. And what we did is we developed a short email that we sent out. We automated the email to go to their inbox every morning. And it was a kind of an easy thing. We did a one-time email batch preparation. They went out as like a morning greeting, like, just remember, here's the strategies we want you to be thinking about. And we found great improvement from this low intensity strategy because it served as a reminder as they started their day. Another way that you might kind of encourage folks to remember to implement is helping them self-monitor. When we're creating a checklist, for our workout, our strength plan, or our different activities, if you're trying to drink more water, having that self-monitoring checklist can be really helpful in facilitating implementation long-term. So what are those strategies? Are you going to have the teachers do it themselves and keep it, or are you going to ask them to share out at the next meeting? Beyond those types of practices, for teachers who kind of really need support, if we think about the MTSS triangle, that is also relevant for us as adults, right? Some folks will just need that high quality training and adaptive practices. Some teachers will need prompts and self-monitoring, and some teachers will need ongoing coaching to shift their behavior. So when we think about being responsive and efficient with our implementation support, we want to be thinking about who are the folks that need additional support to be successful, and how can we facilitate that with high quality coaching? How can we make sure that we are supporting the educators so they can do what they need to do to sustain practice? Again, this may seem like a lot of effort, and I'm not going to say that it's not a different shift, but I think remember that you're going to either spend the time, running after students, kind of making new plans for students, moving students up the triangle of support, which requires additional intensity, additional resources, and others, or we can spend the time supporting the educators to implement the practice. So we're either going to spend that time on the student side, or we're going to spend that time on the educator side. And I'd encourage you, for resource reasons, for ethical reasons, for lots of reasons, to be focused in on that educator side. All right. So again, preparation is an ongoing process. We're going to make sure that we have high quality training, that we're thinking about implementation as we're asking folks to take on new pieces, that we're being responsive to their support and where they are with their practice. And then we can move on to that implementation phase. So how do we support across time? And this is where you, as an administrator, have an opportunity to really lead use of that practice. And that doesn't mean you need to be on the ground delivering social skills groups. I know that's not what you are signed up for, but rather that you are kind of highlighting your commitment towards the initiatives that you've asked folks to take on. So some practical ways that you can lead use of key practices is to know about the practice, know deeply about what it entails, and in doing so, demonstrate your commitment and investment. The other piece of this is supporting staff to use the practice. So that's going to look like different things depending on the practice, but your knowledge, support, and investment goes a long way into helping educators see that this is a priority. This will be followed through on, and it keeps it top of mind for the educators in your buildings. So let's talk about what this can look like, because it can look different across different practices and initiatives. So say you are wanting to encourage your teams and your community to be using data and developing specific goals. So rather than just saying, we want to do better, having a clear understanding and a shared understanding about what better looks like with a specific goal can be so critical. There's a lot of research to say that when we have a goal, a specific goal, we're much more likely to effectively reach and exceed that goal than when we just have a vague better. So helping your teams to utilize data more often and operationalize specific goals can be a really important, effective practice for you to be encouraging. So how can you encourage that ongoing work? Well, one thing is you can use school-wide goals or school-wide data to inform goals, to demonstrate and develop a deep knowledge of this expectation for your school community. So for example, you might say, right now, 20% of our school meetings include data. By January, we want to increase this to 50%. Depending on your data and your teams, this may or may not be a reasonable goal, but I want to highlight two things. One, we're not going from 20% to 100%, right? We're not making unreasonable expectations. The idea here is growth, and the goal needs to be reasonable and attainable. The other piece I want to highlight here is this isn't an extra assessment. There's nothing else we need to do to have these data. This school-wide data and these goals are reflective of what we're already doing. So we're not adding a burden of data collection. We're just simply understanding our processes and articulating a specific goal. Another example of a school-wide goal, if your tier 1 system is really strong, that's something you want to keep building on. You might have 40% of the teachers share that they retaught expectations in the last week. When we survey in November, we want to be at 70%. So there might be a brief survey to help facilitate that kind of check-in about goals. But the idea isn't just that we, quote, improve tier 1, but we're being really specific about what we want our educators to do. And again, when we add that specificity, we're more likely to follow through and experience success. In addition to this modeling of using data and specific goals, we also want to make sure that we're looking for barriers that might challenge teams and educators from meeting those goals and addressing them. So for data, that might be things like making sure the databases are acceptable. Don't have maybe 3 or 4 different people you need to email before you can get that spreadsheet. How can we make that more accessible? Maybe instead of everyone making their own Excel or Google Sheets spreadsheet, maybe there can be some templates that you can utilize to reduce that, the task being burdensome. Can you practice data review at faculty meetings? Again, maybe this seems simple, but one thing we know is things are complex and people require reteaching. So practicing it as a school community, and maybe have some kind of more folks with expertise in this area, like a school psychologist or an interventionist, sit in at grade level team meetings to support the data review. So again, this is how we are as leaders demonstrating and being responsive to needs and showing them that we can make this a priority. Last, in the demonstrate category, I really encourage you to kind of bring these pieces up consistently. Be public about where teams are at with their data and their goals. Have model teams demonstrate their use so others can learn from them. Make time at meetings to highlight and talk about challenges, to problem solve, to share out, and share progress. So when we look at the goals that we set above, you don't need to wait till January to see whether we're seeing changes in your school meetings. Look at October and November, see if you're on the way. Again, showing that kind of ongoing use of data and modeling of kind of how you're managing and being responsive to those data really provides that modeling and keeps things top of mind and demonstrates that that is an important priority. And again, when we talked about initiative overload, the effort that you make to highlight practices and demonstrate your commitment goes a really long way into making these practices sustainable. In another example, I know a lot of you are thinking about how you can integrate behavior and academics in your MTSS systems. No student is a silo of like, here's my academic abilities and here's my behavior abilities. They really are intertwined. We find that students who are not at the appropriate grade level with different material tend to struggle with academic engagement and disruptive behavior more. Also, when students aren't engaging academically or engaging in disruptive behavior, that hurts their academics. So we need to see these pieces as really intertwined. And you can lead this effort by learning how these pieces show up together and consistently linking behavior and academics. We often, again, have very siloed processes for these different topical areas, but that's not necessarily the way they exist for students or educators or teachers who are supporting them. So helping and talking about that link is really key. You also want to be thinking about what are those barriers for our integration? Do we have siloed specialists or people with varied expertise? How can we make sure for the academic specialists join the behavior meetings? How can we make sure folks with behavioral expertise are joining the academic specialist meetings? Just that initial kind of conversation between the two of these experts and can facilitate ongoing collaboration. Adding questions if you have tier 2 or tier 3 protocols, a referral meeting, or that asks about, like, if there's a behavior protocol, can we add some academic questions? How's the student doing in the class? Maybe they know the content and they're bored. Maybe they're so lost academically that they're engaging in disruptive behavior to get out of work. So we want to really prompt teams to engage in that, and putting it on the kind of typical question list can really facilitate that. Make sure that relevant specialists have access to data. So make sure the math specialist can see how many office discipline referrals a student has during math class. Make sure that different information is available so people can provide appropriate and comprehensive support. And then demonstrate your commitment. Make sure when you're reviewing data that you're talking about these pieces together. Demonstrate and talk about the linkages between these data sources. Talk about the goals together. And when you talk about instructional and behavior management strategies, talk about how they intertwine and work together to support academic engagement and student success. So again, that follow through from your end of being consistent in mentioning key initiatives that you care about can facilitate that ongoing reflection. I encourage you to think about what key practices you want to see in your setting and reflecting on, what do you know about the practice? Do you know everything you need to know to be an effective advocate of the practice? Who do you need to talk to in your school building to get up to speed to be the strongest advocate you can be? What are the barriers that your staff are experiencing related to the practice? How can you proactively remove those barriers so that they can more efficiently meet that expectation? And then how can you continually demonstrate your investment, right? If you really care about this, how can you make it the thing that staff know you're going to ask about on a regular basis so it remains top of mind to them? So I encourage you to kind of think through those pieces as you think about how you're going to engage and lead use of those effective practices. And then we're going to persevere over time. With a system like MTSS, there's no end point. And so what we want to be doing when we think about our system is kind of, how do we take MTSS on while how do we learn and grow and understand our system, adjust, adapt for continuous improvement? And one way from a lot of like public health literature suggests that there's this kind of simple process that we can use to kind of move through problems and engage in sustained practice across time. And it's what we call the Plan, Do, Study, Act process. And very likely you are doing this already. I'm guessing, though, that sometimes when we're doing this process, it feels like, shouldn't we be done with this? But I really want to encourage you that life is just one Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle over and over as we continually learn, evolve, our populations change, our teachers change. So don't be afraid of the process and just embrace it and continue on with it. So first, when we're thinking about our MTSS initiative, you might be thinking about, how is it going? What should we do differently? And again, we talked about those exploration questions earlier. How do we think really planfully about what we need to do different? So once we have a clear plan about what we want to do differently, then let's try it. Let's document that we did it. Let's say what we did and what we weren't able to do. Let's be honest rather than, distant and just kind of expecting things to happen. But what could happen? What did we do? Then we want to reflect. How did it go? What did we learn from this process? Oh, we made this SEL initiative. Teachers weren't able to find time in their days, or we made this SEL initiative and only half the teachers did it. We made this SEL initiative and the upper grades did it, but the younger grades didn't because it wasn't clear. What did we learn? How did it go? And we're not, again, coming from the perspective of it needs to happen perfectly right away, but what did we learn about how it went? And then act. How can we make changes to do it better next time? And then we kind of go in this cycle again. So we're always living in this Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. And I encourage you to work with your teams to engage in these practices. So when we think about MTSS and the big ideas, we're focusing on high quality supports for all students. We're being responsive when challenges arise, and we're trying to be systematic. And so how can we take these big ideas and kind of use them to engage in this Plan, Do, Study, Act? Many of you are familiar with the PBIS, the TFI, which is a fidelity inventory, which can be really helpful in helping to identify practices that your team might want to focus on or your school might want to focus on. Again, it's not expected that folks have 100% implementation. You want to rather accurately identify where you are now and pick the one or two things that you're going to try to improve, make that database goal make it public, and work to address barriers and advocate and demonstrate leadership around those practices. So when we think about these kind of key practices at Tier 1, we want to make sure that we have a team that is regularly meeting, that we have school-wide expectations that are taught, responsive strategies, you're reviewing data, the team is reviewing data and also fidelity data. Going back to these basics of Tier 1 will give you the biggest bang for your buck as far as effort on and kind of growth in your school system. I also want to encourage you to use this same framework for how you're thinking about academics in your school building. Do you have an academic team that is looking at school-wide data, making sure students are being clearly taught their expectations, and that we have clear strategies when a student is struggling? Are we reusing that data? Do we have a sense of fidelity and how students are doing when exposed to that Tier 1 general education curriculum? Where you see opportunities for growth in Tier 1, again, I really encourage your teams to focus there in their Plan, Do, Study, Act profile, because that will have, again, the biggest bang for our buck as far as broad student improvement. When we get to Tier 2 and Tier 3, we want to think about the practices that we have for students who are struggling and systematizing those practices. So again, when we went back and we saw, it's not that we need many interventions. We need a few key interventions that are evidence-based, that can be efficiently applied, that are effective. And so making sure that we have a Tier 2 system that can be responsive in supporting the students who are engaging in initial struggles. We also, once we're at a Tier 3 level, we want to make sure we have a Tier 3 team that's monitoring all of our students, but also responsive teams to individual students that really are monitoring how that student is doing. This is a place where, again, focusing on sustained practices can save us a huge amount of money if we're going to support students in the general education environment, rather than having the students kind of need additional or extra support. So figuring out where your school is, what's going well, what's not, figuring out the very few practices that we want to support can facilitate that Plan, Do, Study, Act activity, and really focus your team on addressing key targeted practices and supporting them over time. So again, don't be scared of that persevere over time. Just because you're not at 100% and things aren't automatic doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means you are working with humans and you're within a system. So making sure that you are not frustrated by that Plan, Do, Study, Act process, but rather see that as a fundamental part of your work. That will really encourage that ongoing evaluation, growth mindset, and change. So we've talked about a lot of pieces, and I want to bring us back to kind of the fundamentals before we open it up for questions. Remember that a sustained practice is implemented consistently and comprehensively across time. And when we have sustained practice, it's better for students, educators, our school resources, and in some cases, it's required by law. So we really want to be making sure that we are focused on supporting and sustaining practices for a myriad of reasons. We talked through some key practices, focusing on a small number of new needed practices, not taking time to prepare, demonstrating and leading use of the practice, and then persevering over time. For more resources about supporting sustained practices as an administrator, feel free to look at our resources at sustaincollaborative.org. And remember, behavior change in general is a process. It's not an event. So again, if folks don't immediately adopt, if there are issues, don't hesitate to dig in and continue. We will also want to highlight that we are currently running a federally funded research study to support teachers, with students, elementary school teachers, with students who are struggling with behavior in the classroom, and providing consultative support to teachers to implement behavior plans. We would love to get your school involved. If you're potentially interested or want to know more, you can reach us at prime@uconn.edu, and there's more information at our website, including a principal Q&A. So if you have questions, they might be there, but also don't hesitate to email us. We will be running this study for the next few years. So if you are interested, but it's not a good fit right now, again, feel free to email us and get on that email list so we can support your teachers. And don't hesitate to reach out. Like we said, check out our resources. Dr. Sinetti and I have a book on effective implementation, and we would love to keep talking with you about this topic. So thanks again for having us.
Great. I'm going to give it a second just to see if anyone has any questions. Just a reminder, you can put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. All right. I don't see any. So your information was up there. As I had said, we are going to email this. Oh, we'll be sharing this out to everybody. So your contact information is there. So thank you both for everything, all that information. I know it's extremely helpful to everyone who is struggling with the same problems within school and how to address those. Again, thank you to our corporate sponsors, Horace Mann and MCM Fundraising. We've recorded today's webinar. Everyone will receive that via email when it's available within a few days. And then just a note for everybody, we really hope you attend future CAS programs coming up in the next couple of weeks. We have play-based learning, meeting standards and supporting executive functioning skills. So those of you who have kindergarten know that there is new legislation. So we are holding 2 overviews of what that could look like within schools. And that is we're repeating the webinar. So October 13th, and then it's repeated on November 14th. How to stay ahead in a world of AI on October 17th is going to be fantastic. It is about AI in general, but also how we as administrators can use AI to help us in our jobs. And then if virtual works best for you, we have some virtual offerings coming up, the ins and outs of Section 504. That would be a great one to attend with a team from the comfort of your office on October 3rd. Building a more inclusive school using the welcoming walkthrough. This is for every school that's looking for ways to make your school more inviting to parents, which should be every school in the state. So that will be on October 24th. And we are repeating that. We're doing it 9 o'clock in the morning and then at 2:30 via Zoom to hopefully accommodate everyone's schedules. And then the CAS registration page has all of our offerings throughout the year. We also send out our news blast on Thursdays. If you are not getting our news blast on Thursdays, please let me know or someone at CAS know so that we can update our email distribution list and get you on that, because that's all full of great information. So on behalf of everyone at CAS, have a great day and thank you again for joining us.